Good afternoon, Year 10. We're going to complete our final lesson in a series of lessons at looking at religious and non-religious attitudes towards environmental sustainability. So basically why Christians, Hindus and humanists would want to care for the world. We know, based on my experience as a GCSE marker, that candidates are not great at giving humanist views, and too often they write general platitudes about humanists not believing in God and wanting to be nice to each other. And we are constantly looking for times when Lytchett students can make their answers stand out, and I think that writing about humanism and doing so referencing theories and scholars and principles and guidelines is going to be one way that your answers are going to stand out. So we're going to give you lots of meaty stuff so that you can write supported humanist views rather than just general waffle. We want our answers to stand out because then you're more likely to get into the top band and get that grade 8 or 9. So if you put the title, Why is Protecting the Environment So Important to Humanists? Then answer the 5 questions. I would like you to answer them using full sentences because then your revision, when you use your exercise book as a revision guide, it's more likely to make sense to you. And remember that Year 11 told us last year that their exercise book was their best revision tool. So more useful than a revision guide that they bought than attending a masterclass or attending a revision session after school. Their exercise book was their top tool. So make yours a good one. So title, date, answer the questions underneath. Put me on pause while you do that, my lovelies. So hopefully you've unpaused me. When you mark this, you are going to do so in a different coloured pen, and we do that because anything that you add in now or you correct in your different colour pen is something you didn't know first time. It's information you haven't managed to retrieve. And so that means by using the different colour pen, it's really obvious where your revision effort needs to go, because you always start with revising the stuff that you struggle to remember. So question 1, or answer 1 rather, is stewardship. That's the principle of caring for the world that God has created. Number 2 is environmental sustainability. That's using natural resources sensibly or fairly so they can be accessed by humans and animals both now and in the future. The songs from the Old Testament that praise the world that God has created are called the Psalms. Now this is another chance to show off your great subject knowledge, because often when candidates are explaining why Christians respect the environment, they go straight to Genesis, which is right, but in addition talk about those Psalms which praise the amazing created world. Again, that will make your answer stand out. In addition, when we did Christian beliefs, you might remember that we looked at the qualities of God, omnipotence being one of them. Creation Psalms could act as a piece of evidence for God's omnipotence. And again, your answer would stand out. The Hindu term that could be translated as soul is Atman, and the town that's associated with environmental projects, so caring for the forests, planting trees, making sure that the rivers are free from pollution, is Vrindavan or Vrindavan, it's sometimes pronounced, and that's supposed to be the town that Krishna grew up in. We will return to that knowledge in Hindu practices because we have to study the environmental projects at Vrindavan, but you've already got an outline of them. We are now going to watch together a video in which Andrew Copson, who is the director, I think is his title, of the British Humanist Association, he's going to tell you what humanism is, and in particular how that affects the way he lives his life, where he gets his information from, what decides for him what's right or wrong. Down the side here I have given you some examples of questions that you can use as a guide when you're taking notes from this video. That way your notes are linked to the focus of the lesson, which is humanist views about the environment. The questions are roughly they are in the order that Andrew talks, and so you might want to be pausing this video as you take notes. I actually do not know why that red cursor is moving on screen. I'm not doing that, which is a little scary. Right, let's listen to Andrew Copson then.
Humanism is a worldview and approach to life which is a combination of a variety of different beliefs and values and attitudes. So a humanist is someone who doesn't think that there's any supernatural side to this universe that we're living in, but thinks that the universe is a natural phenomenon, something to be understood and explored through the techniques of science and observation. Humanists also have a certain attitude towards morality. Humanists don't think that rules of morality come down from some non-human origin, like a god or even like an ancestral tradition. Humanists are people who believe that morality is something that is within us, part of our evolved nature, and something that we have to refresh and think about all the time to try and find the right answer to difficult questions in moral contexts. And a third important humanist attitude that is constitutive of this worldview of humanism is a certain approach to the question of the meaning of life. So again, humanists aren't people who think that meaning is something that comes to us from outside, that somehow the universe has a purpose and we're just part of that. Humanists think that meaning is something that we make in our lives. We do that by attributing meaning to the experiences that we have. One thing that's very important to humanists is to recognise human beings as part of the natural world. We're part of and connected to all of life on this planet. Most specifically, we're animals, and we've evolved from the same common ancestor as other animals on this world. Now, of course, we're different as well from other forms of life. We're distinctive. We've evolved in a certain direction. We have certain capabilities and capacities to a greater extent than other animals have. So we have the ability to reason, the ability to think about our surroundings, the ability to plan ahead. But we also have imagination. We're creative beings. We can give a meaning to our own experiences. We can attribute meaning to experience. We tell ourselves stories in our heads, even about our own lives as we move through them. We're creative. And that's an important aspect to the human being too. There are all sorts of different possible ways of answering the question, what is true? What is the nature of reality? Now, some people are happy to rely on trust. Their parents have told them what's true, what's real, or some authority figure has told them what's true, what's real. Some people think that they can go into alternative states of consciousness to connect with the real reality beyond all this day-to-day life that we have today. A humanist approach is different from both of those. Humanists say that if we want to know what's real, what's true, the starting point is our own senses. We have a way of interacting with the world. We have our sight, we have our touch, we have all our other senses. And through observation and experience, not blindly trusting our senses, of course, because they can deceive us, but through experience, through testing our ideas, our provisional ideas about reality, we can slowly move through our own observation experience and that of other human beings in that community of knowledge. We can slowly move towards a more complete understanding of what reality truly is. One incredibly important fact about life for humanists is that when it ends, it is definitely over. Humanists don't think that there's any sort of future life in which we may carry on, perhaps live eternally. That, to some people, can seem depressing, but to many humanists, it's not depressing at all. It's a dynamic call to action, because if life is going to end and one day be over forever, that's surely a call to make it as meaningful and full and rich as you can in the time that's given to you. Humanists think that a sense of meaning is generated by ourselves. And that means, of course, that there's not just one meaning of life, but that different people have very different meanings in their life. All sorts of different activities can give human beings meaning. Humanists recognise that and celebrate it. The origin of morality is something that is increasingly becoming clear to us, especially as we study human societies in the past, but also other animals. And when we look at our closest relatives in the animal world, for example, other apes, chimpanzees are a very good example, we can see in their nature the sort of behaviours that lie at the foundation of our morality. Right back at the origin of our species, we inherited these evolved capacities, the essential necessary characteristics of animals if they want to live in groups as human beings are evolved to do. Knowing where morality comes from doesn't necessarily help us in solving ethical questions that we might confront day to day, and there the humanist answer is a bit more complex. Humanists don't think that the answer to the question of what is the right or wrong thing to do is simple. They don't think there's just one set of rules that you can read off. Humanists accept that moral decisions take place in contexts. They seek to apply empathy, to think about other people's feelings, but also to apply reason and to think through very carefully the consequences of each moral decision afresh. Humanist ideas aren't just personal beliefs about your own moral conduct in your own private life. They have public consequences. Humanists have very often been campaigners for equality. Humanists don't think that races were created separately, or that people of different genders or sexual orientations have strict preordained roles in this life. Humanists have been campaigners for freedom of thought and freedom of expression, because humanists believe that progress in human civilization is made by people who speak out, who think new things, who share them, who generate new knowledge. And that has also led humanists very often to be political activists for secularism, for the separation of church and state, and the end to restrictions that religious denominations try to put on human freedom.
Okay, so you might need to pause the video just to make sure that you have addressed each of those points. And remember, they were raised in the order that Andrew discusses them, and so you might want to go back a couple of minutes in this video. He was talking for 6 minutes, which might give you a clue of how far you need to go back in the video if you have got something missing. So now I'd like you to make a copy of this table. It wouldn't be a Mrs. McGee PowerPoint if there wasn't some kind of typo. So humanist, can you give that a capital H, please? So you're going to make a copy of this table. This is me being all whizzy with my icons. Where this appears, that's where you're going to screenshot your work and send it to me. Somebody has already sent me this work before I've released the video. They are proper on it. Right. So you're going to make a table, and on the one side you have got Christian beliefs, and on the other side you have got a humanist response. And so this table might give you some counter arguments that you could use in a part D. Remember that in a part D for the life and death topic, you have to include non-religious views. Ideally, that would be in a paragraph on its own, but it would also count if you were giving humanist or non-religious counter-arguments to religious views. And you could use humanism to counter Hindu views as well as Christians. I want to draw your attention to... Look, my red pointer's going mad again. I want you to draw your attention to the fact that it says a Christian belief and a humanist response. Different Christians and different humanists will respond in different ways. So not every Christian will agree with all of these points on the left-hand side, and every humanist might not agree with all the points you have on your right-hand side. And there is also quite a lot of crossover between Christian and humanist practical responses. So write this table out and then give a humanist response. And so I have done the first one for you. So Genesis tells us about the origins of the universe and humanity. And a humanist would reply by saying, actually, religious texts don't have authority. Using that word authority when looking at where people get their ideas from is a good key term to use. So if we want to find out about the origins of the universe and humanity, we turn to scientific evidence. They have authority, or that has authority, not a religious scripture. So put me on pause. My PowerPoint jumped ahead then, sorry. Put me on pause and complete that table. Screenshot it, and then at the end of the lesson you're going to email me your work so I can just keep an eye and check that you're understanding. So I said to you at the beginning of the lesson that we are going to give you some examples of principles or teachings that humanists would use so that you can write in an informed manner about humanist ideas. And so this is another table that you need to get down, and then you're going to screenshot. And so the principles are down the left hand side of the table, and then you're going to tell me how that links with attitudes towards the environment. Okay, so the first one we're going to look at is the harm principle, and in a moment I'm going to show you a video that explains that in a little bit more detail. But basically the harm principle says that humans should be free as long as they're not harming others, and that idea of freedom is really, really important to humanists. That's something that you might use later on in the course when we look at things like censorship and free speech. And then I've said to you that the link with the environment is that we shouldn't do anything that harms the natural world. So you're going to do the same with utilitarianism. That's an ethical, non-religious theory that we studied in Year 9 that's linked with Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill. And that's the idea that you should produce the most happiness and also minimise pain. Next lesson, we're going to look at Peter Singer, who is an example of a utilitarian. The golden rule. And every religious worldview, and indeed Hinduism, and indeed humanism, has an example of a golden rule, which is basically treat others how you should want to be treated. And then down at the bottom, the idea that our actions should be driven by observations of the world, not teachings from a God, supernatural being, prophet, holy book, scientific evidence, and empathy for others. So for each of those, you're going to tell me what's the link with caring for the environment. How might that principle guide what a humanist does and believes? So put me on pause, fill that table in and screenshot it. So now, as promised, we're going to have a look in more detail at the harm principle. The harm principle is associated with a 19th century thinker called John Stuart Mill, and his dates are very similar to those of Darwin. And in the 18th, 19th century, you have lots of revolutionary ideas really that come about that show a shift in culture from getting guidance from religion to getting guidance from observations of the world. And so John Stuart Mill, just like Darwin, is challenging the dominance of religion. But what John Stuart Mill is saying is that you don't need to rely on religious teachings to make moral decisions. Instead, base it on observations of the world, your thinking and reasoning, and trying to produce happiness and minimising pain. So when you are giving a non-religious view, you could refer to John Stuart Mill, and that will make your answer stand out. This is quite a short video. You don't need to write anything or make notes, but it is quite hard, and so you might want to rewind and watch it again.
In his book, On Liberty, John Stuart Mill argues for one simple principle, the harm principle. It amounts to this: the state, my neighbors, and everyone else should let me get on with my life as long as I don't harm anyone in the process. One way of thinking of this is, my freedom to swing my fist ends at the tip of your nose. If I don't have dependents, I should be free to drink myself to an early death, live as an eccentric, or explore alternative lifestyles, as long as no one else is damaged in the process. Paternalism is okay towards children, they need protecting, but never towards adults who are of sound mind. So, let me get on with my experiments of living, and you get on with yours. And even if I'm wrong about the best way to live, it's better to let me make my own mistakes. This individual freedom is the seedbed of genius. It's also the basis of enduring happiness for ordinary people. It needs protecting. Mill favors free speech, too, up to the point where it inflames violence. It's not just what you say, but also where and when you say it that matters. But merely causing offense, he thinks, is no grounds for intervention, because in his view, that is not a harm. He champions dissent because it keeps us on our intellectual toes and stops our beliefs congealing into dead dogma. We need a variety of views to think well. Censorship is the enemy of progress. Not everyone agrees, of course. Critics of Mill's liberalism think he went too far. Our lives are more enmeshed with others than he realized. And some speech causes deep psychological harm, harm that can be as damaging as a fist in the face.
So, a really good GCSE student might say, and this would probably be in a Part D or perhaps a Part B, influenced by the ideas of John Stuart Mill, humanists would stress the importance of freedom but not doing anything that harms the environment. When we come back, as I said, to looking at free speech and censorship, you can also use the ideas of John Stuart Mill and the idea that free speech is really important. So now I want you to make a copy of this, because this is going to help you answer an exam question with a focus on humanism. I want to stress again, it's really worth saying lots of times, because don't be that student that does it. Don't give a humanist view in Part C. That's just for religious views. You're going to use this knowledge either in a short Part B question or in your non-religious paragraph and counter arguments in a Part D. So why should humanists care about the environment? And so this is your neat little summary. So first of all, the world brings us joy. We all love walking out in the countryside, taking in the views, looking at animals, and humanists, see no shame in pleasure, in finding joy. You could link that with utilitarianism. But the world can only bring us joy if we look after it. For humanists, consequences are important. Again, there's a link there with utilitarianism, because utilitarianism is what we call a consequentialist theory. It's not following rules, it's looking at outcomes. And we are threatening our own habitat, and that is only ever going to have negative consequences for us. So if this was an exam answer, you might say thinking about long-term consequences is something that humanists would do, and therefore it doesn't make sense to harm our own habitat. Humanists, like Christians, make a link between environmental concerns and social justice, and climate change often hurts the poorest communities first. Often it's the poorest communities in the world that are living with the consequences of extreme flooding, for example. There's also some really interesting research that says that women, particularly women in poorest communities, are the most likely to be hurt or even die from the consequences of climate change. Linking with the harm principle. So I'm going around clockwise. I'm underneath at the bottom here. We are causing harm to wildlife. We're causing harm to the natural world, which goes against the principles of the harm principle with John Stuart Mill. And so again, a student might say, yes, humanists believe in freedom, but they might say maybe we should limit our freedom in order to stop harming the environment. So yes, I should be free to drive where I wish, but maybe I should think about my consumption of fossil fuels and change my actions to minimise harm. Linked possibly with what we've already said, humanists would say that we should think about the very, very long-term consequences of climate change, because climate change in the long term results in things like famine, which can then lead to war and terrorism and conflict when people start to fight over those resources that have not been shared equally. And so again, a principle for utilitarians is making, for humanists rather, is making observations in the world, and they can see that when countries feel like they have to compete for limited resources, that's when tensions rise. And so we should stop that from happening by caring about the environment, limiting the damage that we do. And then finally, we should take notice of scientific evidence. And there is overwhelming scientific evidence that we are harming the environment and that we need to make changes to our behaviour. And scientists would recommend what changes to make. So make a copy of that, because that's a really good summary to use, both in the exam question you're going to do in a moment, but also when it comes to revising. And look, we have got 6 points here. That's more than enough for part B, certainly enough to make a paragraph in a part D and provide us with some counter arguments. So put me on pause and make a copy of this. So finally, you've worked really hard, so we're going to do a short exam question, which is a part B that's worth 5 marks. This really should not take you more than, well, ideally 5 minutes, but certainly no more than 7 or 8. So you're going to describe the reasons why a humanist would practice environmental sustainability. I think, my lovelies, really carefully about every exam question that I set you, and you will notice that there are 2 things here that could trip up candidates. One, if they don't know what the phrase environmental sustainability means, and secondly, if all they can write about humanism is they don't believe in God and they try to be nice to people. So this question has been chosen to test you on things that we know that students across the country, including Lytchett, find hard. So remember, we say to you, make 5 points, but don't go longer than 7 or 8 minutes. And if you can't think of a 5th point, then stop, because sometimes you can get full marks from 3 well-made supported points. So 5 reasons, if you can, why a humanist would practice environmental sustainability. I have given you your starter mark, if you like. So I've modelled for you a good way to approach this question. When you've done this, screenshot it and send it to me along with your 2 tables, and let me know your score for your quiz.